Kestrus worked up his courage, facing down the mysterious portal that hovered before him. He glanced to his rear, to the 5 hunters who had been chosen to accompany him. They were all proud to have been selected by Lord Cocytus, excited to be sent to a place where their people could build new homes and flourish. Usually, it was rare for lizardmen to have any desire to leave their ancestral homes. In the past year, however, the promise of Einzulgaun to bring prosperity to their people was slowly being fulfilled before their very eyes, so a few had become willing to embark on this great venture. A new tribe of the Lizardman Alliance, one under Kestra's leadership as their chief. Now, as he stared at the portal that was said to lead to their destination, he wasn't so sure if he should be looking forward to it. It was the land of the human he had fought some time ago, in a duel to determine the leadership of the new tribe. Recalling the outcome, he suppressed a shudder. "It would please me if you'd stop gawking at the gate and enter," an imperious voice said from the side. "There's another group headed to Iranthal coming up, and I have a schedule to keep." Kestrus glanced nervously towards the source of the voice, a small, elf-like figure in a voluminous black dress. She was one of the powerful servants of Einzulgaun, rumored to be even more powerful than Lord Cocytus and Lord Mare. There were other rumors surrounding her, too, that she was actually an evil undead creature, a being that reveled in suffering, death, and wanton destruction. The liege of his new liege, what hell was he being cast into? He wished he could return to Lord Cocytus' service, but the Lord of the Great Lake was wroth after witnessing his dismal conduct during the duel as well. Swallowing audibly, Kestrus stepped forward tentatively, hesitating once again at the portal's threshold before squeezing his eyes shut and forcing his legs to move. Warmth washed over him, the scent of cut timber and damp vegetation filled his nostrils. His eyes popped open, blinking rapidly several times as he squinted through the glare of the midday sun. Turning in place, he looked about. A flat stretch of coarse gravel and sand. Endless rows of timber piled high. A broad river with cliffs that towered over the opposite shore. The portal that he had just stepped out of. One of the hunters appeared out of it, colliding into him, and they fell down into a tangled heap. A pair of boots appeared in his upside-down vision. "The landing area of a gate should be cleared of hazards," a voice said. "That would include yourselves." It was her. Kestrus and the hunter scrambled to their feet, getting out of the way of the others coming through the portal. They lined up nearby, eyeing everything nervously. When the last of their group joined them, the portal silently closed. "Welcome to Warden's Vale," she said in a clear tone that arrested their attention. "I believe we've seen one another before, but allow me to introduce myself again. I am Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik, Lord Protector of Warden's Vale and Defender of the Katza Reach." Though the way she spoke was strange, the feeling was eerily familiar. It was the same as when Shazhiryu Shasha, head of the Lizardman Alliance, spoke. The head chief's cool words could quench heated debates on the verge of coming to blows, even between the heads of the warriors and priests. His keen gaze was capable of withering opposition without uttering a single word. Over crowds of men and women on the eve of battle, his voice could still their quavering hearts and raise their spirits. This, then, was a human lord? The travelers spoke nothing of human lords, only that humans as a whole were a soft-skinned race, living in dry places with alien ways. Shazhiryu Shasha was a mighty warrior who could wield druidic magic. Could this human lord do so as well? Had she been concealing her strength? She felt more powerful now than when they had fought some weeks before. A feeling of hostility washed over him and he glanced at its source. Another human, the smaller one who had accompanied the human lord when they came to the Great Lake, was glaring directly in his direction. "Kestrus," he replied hurriedly as he dipped his head. "These hunters with me have come to scout the place where we must live." The sense of hostility vanished, but he couldn't help but silently berate himself after the words came out of his mouth. He was no good at speaking. Lord Cocytus had trained a few who could present themselves eloquently, but he felt the furthest thing from it. Hopefully, he didn't offend. Having his tongue pinned to the ground once was one too many times. The assembled lizardmen shifted uncomfortably as Baroness Zaradnik's sharp gaze ran over them. Kestrus cringed slightly when it returned to him. "It should take some time with your group," she said, "so you should get started right away." "Some time?" He looked around again, seeing nothing but the river, its cliffs and the vast stores of timber. The human lord turned away, gesturing for them to follow. The others looked to Kestrus, and he led them in her wake, around the great piles of logs along the river. It took them several minutes to make their way, then they found themselves on the shore of a marsh that stretched north to the horizon. The members of the scouting party exchanged glances, gazing out and back between themselves again. "Will this suffice?" the human lord asked. This, Kestrus stammered. "All of this?" "If the geese will let you." Her lip curled up slightly. What did that mean? "They can be quite ornery at times, so you may want to be careful around them. Human villagers forage on the shores as well, and my rangers will eventually frequent the area." "Where do you intend for us to live, exactly?" "I have received no information as to how many Lord Cocytus intends to send," she replied. "I assume that it depends on your own findings?" "Why yes, that's right," Kestrus said. "At a glance, I feel that we could move the entire Lizardman Alliance. There is more space to live here than our home at the Great Lake." He looked to the hunters, who all nodded at his words. "In that case," the human lord said, "you should at least bring enough to maintain a viable population." "A viable population? Large enough to prevent inbreeding?" Her expression changed. "I suppose you could also have people move between other places to find suitable partners." I'll have to include that in my report to Lord Cocytus." "I see," she said. "Well, you may set your camps anywhere that suits you while you survey the area." Kestrus looked out at the expanse of dense vegetation, stands of strange trees and flows of water. It was quite different from the marshes in the shallows of the Great Lake. "Is there anything dangerous here?" Kestrus asked carefully, aside from the geese. "Purple worms, swamp sharks or will-o'-wisps, for instance?" "There was," she answered, "once. House Zaradnik has long exterminated any aggressive threats to its people within the borders of Warden's Vale. There are no demi-human tribes out on the floodplain, either." Exterminated. Kestrus finally pinned down the feeling that remained to haunt him since he had fought this human lord. There was a constant pressure that could be felt when fighting her, but, after a certain point, it went from the sense that she saw him as a challenge to her authority, to the impression that he was a pest that she was going to squash. He suppressed a shudder. Even the female accompanying this human lord looked at him like he was nothing more than a stain on cloth. Were all humans like this? "If you have any further questions, or if there is anything you require, I will be in my manor for the rest of the day," the building sticking out of the hill with a Death Knight guarding the door. With those instructions, she turned away and left them to their own devices. Kestrus' gaze followed her partway back to the stony hill in the distance, a fortified position of layered ramparts and fences. Shaking his head, he turned back to his hunters. "How should we begin?" asked a black-scaled female. "Materials for the camp, first," he answered. "We should stick to the shore for now." The soft-skinned chief said that there's nothing really dangerous, yet they live on a fortified hill of stone. Perhaps there are animals like venomous snakes and giant toads lurking in the water. The group spread out, looking for a convenient location to stockpile materials and construct shelters. Their heads turned up when a pair of large undead appeared, carrying a tree trunk between them. He could not tell exactly how strong they were, but they were beyond the power of the Nazarick old guarders that were employed to defend the village at the Great Lake. They stomped by without pause, placed the trunk atop one of the piles, and went back the way they came. He motioned for the hunters to head further north. It was probably best to not be underfoot. They eventually found themselves at the end of the timber yard, over 2 kilometers away from where they had started. The marsh still stretched on, but he thought he could see a rise on the far northern end. They gathered reeds from the shore, weaving them into tight mats. Mud was slathered on them to form panels for their makeshift huts, ones that could be dismantled and moved as they explored this new place. Well into the evening, a cozy ring of shelters had appeared, and a fire crackled in its midst. The scouting party squatted around the fire, sorting out their provisions. The black-scaled female, Ezri's, spoke as she munched on a smoked carp. "So far," she said, "this place shows abundance. Finding enough to build these shelters would have taken days back home. While foraging for materials, I noticed crabs and fish and plenty of useful plants. I thought we would be brought to some meager place, reluctantly afforded to us, but the marsh here is vast. It is a great surprise that no one lives here." She was plainly excited about their prospects. Her eyes shone as she spoke, and the tip of her tail tapped the ground rhythmically. Why is it surprising? You heard the soft-skinned chief, exterminated. Anything they didn't like, they callously killed off. Now they have this entire valley to themselves. You are letting the bounty of this place blind you, Azries. Others have surely paid the price for it in the past. The cynical counter came from a male with sand-colored scales, Usurius. Kestris considered his opinion more balanced. This valley was akin to a jealously guarded treasure, and the way that the human lord carried herself did not give off the aura of someone who wallowed in uncontested luxury. After his fight with her, he understood that she was a ruthless, trained killer, someone who probably had the blood of many on her hands. We're her vassals now, aren't we? A hint of uncertainty entered Esri's voice, and her tail went limp. I don't think Lord Cocytus sent us here to be exterminated. Maybe, Usurius said, maybe not. You heard what Lord Cocytus said. This soft-skinned chief is someone else's vassal. The rumors about her, we cannot expect Lord Cocytus' kindness here. He said we would learn fear, said a female with mottled grey scales on the other side of the fire. What does that mean? Are these humans going to eat us? Our people can probably flourish in this place, maybe they intend on having us farmed like fish. I was meaning to ask about that later, a voice came from somewhere. The human lord suddenly appeared before them, the campfire casting a grim light over her features. Everyone cried out in terror. Half dove into their huts, Kestris and Esries fell over themselves. Yensius, the grey-scaled female, went stiff-tailed before fainting dead away. I ask about what? Kestris asked after he had recovered his wits. The fish farms, the human lord's teeth gleamed in the light of the fire. Do you believe it possible to cultivate them here? Fish farms? Did she plan on feeding the lizardman fish, then feed the lizardman to her people? No, that didn't sound quite right, but still. I'm not certain, he offered a non-committal response. The ones that helped build the fish farms are back at the Great Lake. I do not know if any will come here. I suppose I will need to negotiate with Lord Cocytus for their construction, the human lord said. Do you know how the fish are raised? From what I've seen, they're now raised from fries, and the farms are divided by age. Lord Cocytus has grain brought in to feed the fish, but I think there are some other things added. The human stared at him the entire time, causing him to shift uncomfortably. I see, she said. I should check on their requirements as well. How are things so far? You seem to have made yourselves comfortable here. Why yes, Chief, Kestris said. Materials that we are accustomed to using are close and plentiful, so it went faster than anticipated. We'll begin our work in the morning. That is good to hear, she said. Can any of you read or write? I don't think so. A few have learned, those most eloquent that Lord Cocytus has selected to be trained, but we are none of that number. The human lord reached into a pouch at her side, withdrawing a thick roll of parchments. She separated one out and held it out to him. Can you understand this, then? He took the proffered sheet of paper, carefully unfurling it in his claws. It looked like a map, but of what, he wasn't sure. He passed it over to Esries, who had untangled herself and returned to her feet. A map? She looked down at it, then at their surroundings. It's only for the area near here, though. The human lord nodded slowly after the hunter's response, reaching into the pouch again. Kestris inexplicably found himself carrying a small pile of maps and blank paper shortly after. Since you will be conducting a survey of the floodplain, she told them, I will be adding your findings into the domain archives. Each of these sheets contains a section of the area, and you should be able to cover one of these maps per day. Each day, your chieftain will report your work to me at the manor, for the southern third, at least. I will send someone to you once you've made your way too far north to get back and forth quickly. He looked down at the maps in confusion. What was the purpose of this? Though Lord Cocytus had spearheaded the subjugation of other tribes in the vicinity of the Great Lake, and now oversaw its development, he usually relied on the existing experience of the locals for knowledge of the land. At any rate, the human lord said, the day must have been a long one for you, so that will be all for this evening. Remember to report to me at my manor tomorrow. Saying nothing further, she turned around and disappeared into the night. Kestris stepped out after her, peering in the direction that she had gone in, but he couldn't tell where she was. Lizardman had dark vision, but she had either gone beyond its range or was quite stealthy. He looked over his shoulder several times as he returned to fire, unable to free his mind of the idea that there might be a predator stalking nearby. Back at the fire, he frowned down at the maps in his claws. Wait, he was already supposed to start reporting to her? The two who had hidden in their huts poked their heads out, while Ezrees was trying to rouse Yensius, who was still passed out on the gravel. She didn't deny it. Usurious' low voice drifted out from his hut. Didn't deny what? It took a moment for Kestris to realize what he was referring to. Oh. Well, she only mentioned the fish farms at the Great Lake. Maybe humans hear things differently? Usurious made his way out of his shelter and shivered, quickly padding over to the fire and tucking in his tail. The valley they were in was deep, and shadows fell over the land earlier than usual, making it cooler than they were used to. Icy winds came down from the Azalizia Mountains at the Great Lake, but the sun also stayed over the horizon longer to lend the cold-blooded lizardman its warmth. Having a human chief aside, those who came to live here would need to make some basic changes to their way of life. I cannot say if humans hear things differently from us, Usurious said, but you've seen the way that she moves. That one is a hunter. She must have seen and heard what was said long before we even realized she was there. Kestris couldn't refute his words. Hunters had supernaturally sharp senses that grew as they became more powerful, some even had ways to enhance them even further. Stop trying to scare everyone, Ezrees hissed at Usurious. We must make the best of what is offered, or she will make less of us than what we are. Her words are those of one who is accustomed to using others, like the chiefs and elders back home. Besides, Lord Cocytus forbids the peoples of the lake from eating one another. Why should it be any different here? Naive, Usurious said, too naive. We're the same age. Ezrees scowled as she went to throw a blanket of reeds over the still unconscious Yensius. What suddenly makes you so much wiser than I? Remember who she serves. That vampire. A monstrous undead being that feeds on the living. Who knows how many this human has sacrificed to slake her mistress' thirst? Have you not considered that we will be included in that number when our people come to live here? Maybe this chief only appears to be human, none of us are familiar with how they're supposed to look or behave. She might be another undead who considers us a future meal. Enough. Kestris told them, Ezrees is right, we cannot go back to the Great Lake, so we must do our best here. To falter will only make things worse. Our situation is still better than the hard times of years past when the tribes suffered from wars and seasons of starvation. If we are truly allowed to settle where we wish, our people that come here will quickly grow and thrive with the plenty that is clear to see. We will become a great tribe and, if we create many of the fish farms she is so interested in, perhaps she will not sacrifice too many of us to her bloodthirsty mistress. My lady, there's so much blood. I think I have this figured out now, but get another towel, just in case. I can't watch this. Ludmilla watched the crimson trickle run down her forearm, wrist and off of her pinky finger. Amelia came and left a towel on the desk, pointedly looking away from the scene as she did so, before scurrying off again. She wasn't sure why her maid was perfectly fine with watching her fight the lizardman at the Great Lake, yet had become so squeamish with what she was currently doing. There was a decanter below Ludmilla's hand, slowly filling with her blood. It was a magical container, originally meant for storing drinks that could spoil, enchanted with both a preservation effect and one that maintained the temperature of its content. If it could keep anything from water to wine to fruit drinks icy and fresh, Ludmilla figured it could also store blood and keep it warm. She didn't know for certain, however. After asking about it in uncomfortably roundabout ways, she finally decided to give it a try. There were several troubles along the way, such as keeping the cut on her arm open and trying to figure out how to get it to flow into the decanter properly, but things now appeared to be working reasonably well. Are you sure about this, my lady? Amelia asked from where she stood at a distance. I don't think people are supposed to bleed that much, or at all. I've seen people lose far more than this and still be perfectly fine after a bit of rest, she replied. Besides, the first time didn't feel bad at all. Blood continued to flow into the decanter. They were able to fill it earlier that morning and, as she had mentioned, there were no apparent ill effects. She quaffed a healing potion just in case, which then resulted in the blood mysteriously disappearing from the decanter. Unable to figure out why that was, she had no choice but to try again. This time, she would just use an ointment that would allow the cut to heal quickly without scarring. She supposed that the mere fact that she was doing something like this would strike nearly anyone as odd. After receiving special dispensation from the royal court that allowed her to create laws in her domain for species with unique predator-slash-prey relationships, she drew one up for the Kronos so that they could continue their ways within the bounds of her territory. After that, she started thinking about whether there were any other potential areas unique laws along those lines might be applied, and that thinking eventually led to Lady Shiltier. Her liege was a vampire, after all. When they worked together, Lady Shiltier would always eventually draw close to her, lightly touching her from time to time or grasping her arm. When they sat down to work on one thing or another, she would bring her seat near to Ludmilla and eventually start leaning in close. At first, she thought that Lady Shiltier was just the warm and affectionate type, much like Clara was. After altering her perspective, Ludmilla considered it possible that she was actually thirsty. Maybe it was both. The idea that she might actually be torturing her vampire liege through their interactions was not something that had crossed her mind before, and guilt started to pile upon her. And so, resolving that she should at least try to do something about it, she went out and bought the enchanted decanter after some research on how they worked. Watching her blood slowly drain away, Ludmilla organized her thoughts for the upcoming day. After the long days of adventurer training in Irantal, Lord Mayor had allowed her to keep both the Ring of Sustenance and the magical collar with the idea that it would help her do more work for the Sorceress Kingdom. That they seemed so common made Ludmilla wonder if her friends could be spared the rings as well. Clara, at least, would greedily snap up such a handy item. Ludmilla used the trip back up the river as an opportunity to sleep, so everything she needed to organize beforehand had been done the night she arrived in Warden's Vale. The surveyors for the new Lizardman tribe arrived yesterday, and she needed to make sure that they understood what she desired out of them. Lord Mayor would arrive in a few days to reshape the land for the next farming village, so she needed to make some last-minute checks there as well. She had yet to hear anything new on the Adventurer Guild's training expedition, but she would be able to ask about it when he came. The first two members of Xenon would be arriving at some point in the week by way of the river. She would need to ensure that they would comply with the laws of the realm, then preparations for their workshop would have to be discussed. As for everything else, the borders were secure with no reported disturbances, the Kronos was slowly trickling in, and the summer harvest was well underway. The regular operations of her domain were advancing according to schedule, so all that was left was to study her materials, train, make the occasional patrol, and wait for problems to address between various appointments. Freeing up so much time with the Ring of Sustenance was surely a wonderful thing. When the volume of blood reached the base of the decanter's slim neck, Ludmilla took a clean cloth from the desk, pressing it to the cut on her forearm. She stopped at the crystal container and waited for anything strange to happen to its crimson content. After several minutes with no change, she decided that the idea was working so far, and went about dressing her wound. A rapping sound issued from the door. Amelia came out to answer, and Ludmilla picked up the decanter, heading to the back of the manor to lock it away. She hoped that her idea would be useful to Lady Shiltier. Anticipation was already starting to build up over her liege's reaction. Returning to the hall, she found the chief of the Lizardmen awaiting her. She stepped in behind her desk, placing a hand lightly upon its worn wooden surface. Then they stood unmoving across from one another in silence. Ludmilla saw Amelia out of the corner of her eye. She was trying to glare a hole into the Lizardman. Lady Shiltier said that Lord Cocytus was trying to instill some etiquette into the Lizardman, but perhaps this one hadn't taken too well to it. He had not introduced himself before their duel, either. Then again, she wasn't sure what their regular customs were, nor did she know how to read their expressions. "Good morning, Chief Issess," she said. "Ah, he seemed to come to life again." "Yes, good morning, Chief. I've come as you've ordered." Chief Issess promptly answered, as if spurred to reply by her words. His tone did not seem to hold any disrespect or ill will, however, perhaps he was just unpracticed. "How did you find the conditions overnight?" she asked. "This valley appears to be at a higher altitude than the Great Lake," Chief Issess answered, "and its depth limits some of the daylight, so it's cooler than we are used to at this time of year. Are lizardmen sensitive to temperature? Will it be a problem for your families?" Moo, with shelter, it will not be too bad, I think. If we build good homes over the water, the temperature will be warmer and more stable. He appeared to ponder after he spoke. This place, how cold will it become in winter? Snows will cover the mountains, passes and highlands around the vale during the winter, she told him. The bottom of the valley sometimes sees snow, but it never gets cold enough to stay. The lizard-man chief was silent for a while, and Ludmilla glanced out the window beside her desk. Outside, there was a smaller, black-scaled lizard-man that appeared far more energetic than the one in the hall with her. Her tail was waving sinuously about as she looked around, and the villagers were doing their best to not get distracted from their work. She turned back to look at Chief Issess, who continued to ponder. Will this be an issue? Ludmilla spoke into the silence. I'm not sure. The chief looked down. At the foot of the Azalizia Mountains, the Great Lake sees cool winters, but snow is a rare event. Past travelers have claimed that it becomes warmer the further south one goes, so I thought it may be the case here. This is true, Ludmilla said, but we are not that far south. Warden's Vale is over 150 kilometers southwest of the Great Lake. Truly? He tilted his head. The Sorceress Kingdom is a mighty nation, so I thought we would be sent to some distant land. Ludmilla smiled inwardly. Considering how powerful it was, the Sorceress Kingdom would certainly be thought of as some vast empire rather than a single duchy by almost anyone. In all of her interactions with the members of the royal court, she could never get a sense of where else it might be present beyond Erantle. Well, in our case, Ludmilla told him, it only takes about a day and a half to get to Erantle by way of the river, and Erantle is only about 3 days by wagon to the Great Lake. You can get there quite easily if you have a need, Chief Issess. I see. He looked back up at her. I am curious, however, why do you call me chief? You are our new chief, no? I am serving as your liege, but I am not your chief in that sense. Lord Cocytus chose you to lead the immigrants, yes? But I was defeated by you in a ritual challenge. She furrowed her brow over his confusion. I suppose I should explain how human lands work, she said. If I understand it correctly, your tribes were brought together under the leadership of Lord Cocytus to live in a single village. That is correct, Chief. In human lands at large, the initial form of address with titled persons is by their title, she explained, and my lady will suffice for me after that. Warden's Vale is the name by which my territory has become known, but the title is actually Zaradnik. House Zaradnik is the name of those whose members tamed this land. So, Lady Zaradnik. Then my lady. That's right, Ludmilla smiled slightly. Now, how does one address a lizardman chief? Just chief usually, my lady. Then it is the same as small human settlements, she said. Are there other positions of importance? Those responsible for organizing various portions of your tribes? There are the heads who represent important groups, the high priestess, the head warrior, the head hunter, and also the elders. How large were your tribal villages before Lord Cocytus gathered them together? My own, the Green Claw tribe, had around 400, including children. I see, your villages are much larger, around the size of a small human town. Human villages do not have a need beyond the chief and a handful of elders, but human towns have a mayor and his advisors. Ludmilla turned to look out of the window, gazing out over the floodplain. If what she saw at the Great Lake was an accurate representation of what could be supported in an area, Warden's Vale would be able to accommodate thousands of lizardmen in the future. Tell me, Chief Issess, she asked as she glanced around to find the lizardman that had been wandering around, if you were to conjure the image of a perfect lizardman village in your mind, what would it be like? Mayu. His tail twitched slightly. A perfect village, 1,000 would be considered prosperous. With the new fish farms, there would be no starvation. Anything else? I feel that we would be happy with this, Chief Issess replied, as long as our families are safe. The chief seemed to consider little more than security, numbers and food, with no mention of industries, services or trade. Though exposed to the undeniably advanced Sorceress Kingdom for much longer than the humans of Erantle, nearly a year, if the accounts she heard were correct, the lizardmen carried the basic outlook of many primitive demi-human tribes, who were satisfied with subsistence, out in the wilderness. Unless they bred quite rapidly, Chief Issess' vision of a prosperous village was a far-off future. Lord Cocytus' desires for the lizardmen appeared to be far more than this. He made attempts at teaching them proper protocol and instilling a warrior code into them. Ludmilla wasn't sure if it was by Lord Cocytus' request, but Lady Shaltir had purposely included their village at the Great Lake as a link in the aerial transportation network as well. If they were to be integrated fully into the Sorceress Kingdom, able to make tangible contributions of their own, then Ludmilla supposed that her job would be to not only ensure their survival under her rule but to organize them in some productive and advantageous way. The first thing she thought would be required was to lay out some sort of groundwork that allowed them to mesh well with her style of governance, as well as figure out ways to qualify their inherent advantages. "I am certain that a village of 1,000 will not be a problem, Chiefy says," Ludmilla told him, "but that number seems quite a ways away unless your people are naturally fecund." Yes, my lady." He paused awkwardly for a moment. "No, I meant our families are not overly large. 1,000 would take generations. Even the village at the Great Lake barely has that number. The tribes had many more, once, but in the war last year, and in the hard times of the past, hundreds perished." "In that case," she said, "we will ensure that your village is ready to take advantage of what the Sorceress Kingdom has to offer before then. Lord Cocytus has charged me with your growth and development, so I will be ensuring that the appropriate measures are taken to secure a valued place for your people in our nation." The chief's tail went limp. "Though your priorities will lie with directing the survey work for now, you will also be learning how the various structures of the Sorceress Kingdom function, and we can explore the ways that your people may integrate with them." "Structures?" He stared at her. "Yes," she nodded. "Structures. The government, economy and the many national and private institutions that exist in our nation. As a leader of your people, it will be important to understand how they each affect them." "Moo. Moo?" Chiefy Sess brought a clawed hand to his nose, scratching it lightly. "I haven't sent the hunters to start their work yet," he said. "Please allow me to go out and get them started." "Of course," Ludmilla smiled. "I will come with you as well. We can begin our work while you oversee your surveyors." Kestrus Sess wasn't exactly sure what happened. After a night curled up in his makeshift shelter, under a pile of half-dried reeds, he awoke to the gloomy chill of the morning. He forced himself out to start a new fire, moving about in the thick mists to warm himself up. The others stirred before he headed off to the human lord's place, and Ezri's tagged along, excited to see what a human village was like. Kestrus was almost certain the female would get herself in some sort of trouble, but her excitement made it hard to refuse her. It was so cold in the depths of the valley. Where did she get all of her energy? They walked several kilometers, past the timber yards into the fortress village beyond. Along the way, they stopped and scurried back behind a row of timber, peeking out at a massive feline beastman who must have been twice his length. It stalked across their way silently, on the heels of several small, woolly creatures less than half of Kestra's size. He didn't focus much on them, however. He was preoccupied looking at the dagger-sized fangs of the beastman and the wickedly curved claws poking out of its huge paws. Was the terrifying beastman tending to its livestock? He wasn't sure how such a large being could survive on so few of the small creatures. Did they prey on other things in this land? Maybe it might consider the lizardman as a decent meal. Against his better judgment, he came out to fearfully ask some questions, but then they flew, making their way over the broad river to the cliffs on the other side. Kestrus and Ezri's could only stare in disbelief as the beastman and its small herd of livestock floated away to become mere specks over the water. How did these humans survive in a place where giant, predatory beastmen flew? None of the undead sentries appeared to pay it any mind. This human lord must have displayed her dominance over these beastmen somehow. Kestrus was starting to think he was quite lucky getting away with just having his tongue stabbed. Shortly after they entered the village, he lost sight of Ezri's, who had probably gotten distracted by something, somewhere. He hoped she wouldn't end up causing some sort of trouble. Making his way awkwardly up the stairs and ramparts, he wondered if anything had actually ever tried attacking this place. It seemed a difficult thing for his kind, at least. Along the way, humans would glance at him briefly before returning to their tasks and, partway up the hill, he found the building with the Death Knight that the human lord had described. Upon being let in by the mean-looking human attendant, he was overwhelmed by the odor of blood. Kestrus looked all about the place nervously as he waited in front of a small desk. His dark vision allowed him to see the interior, but he couldn't figure out where the scent was from. The discussion of the previous evening came back to him. Maybe the vampire had just visited, and a grisly sacrifice made. He did not have long to dwell on the image, however, as the human lord came to stand at the desk before him. Then he was buried in a mountain of words, many of which he did not understand. Now, he staggered back out, having made the excuse that he needed to have his hunters start their work. Kestrus had risen not an hour ago, yet he was already exhausted. On the way back down, he found Ezri's being dangled high above the ground, a death knight holding the hunter up by her tail. Her head was pointed straight down at the grass, and her jaw hung slightly open. She swung back and forth lightly in the wind but was otherwise very still. Ezri's. He managed to stammer out her name at the sight. The black-scaled female stirred, turning her head to eye Kestrus. "Oh," she said, "a handsome chief has come to my rescue? I tried playing dead, but this undead wishes to keep me." "Did you do something?" he asked. "I went inside this building here," she pointed to some sort of shed. "Humans were going in and out and the door was open, so I thought to see what it was about. Then there was this little skeleton inside that became angry at me." Lady Zaradnik walked past them, entering the building behind the undead sentry. "This is an outrage, my lady." A miffed voice drifted out, that Think came inside and started rooting around all over the place. "She ignored my protests, so I had no choice but to have the gentleman outside take her away." "Was anything stolen?" "Well, no, but half the warehouse is a mess now," the voice sighed. "Please tell me we are not going to have random reptiles entering and poking their heads everywhere, my lady." "I will have a word with them, Jeeves." Lady Zaradnik appeared in the doorframe, walking back out to stand in front of Kestrus and Ezri's. Her eyes went from one of them to the other. "Hello," Ezri's smiled. "Do your people have the habit of going through others' belongings, Chiefess?" "No, my lady," he replied. "This one is simply too curious for her own good." "As chief," Lady Zaradnik said, "the conduct of your people is your responsibility. If the situation becomes so severe that I am forced to act personally, the result may not be to your liking." "Yes, my lady." He dipped his head. Will I need to find a new hunter? Or?" The undead dangling Ezri's over the ground released its hold, and she flopped to the ground. The young huntress scrambled to her feet, rubbing her tail as they followed Lady Zaradnik down the hill. To Kestrus' great relief, she made no further attempts to get herself into trouble, and Lady Zaradnik wasted no time in returning to their camp on the shores of the floodplain. They arrived to the sight of the other 4 hunters basking in the sun. The lizardman seemed entirely oblivious to their approach, so Kestrus started dragging his feet over the gravel. Lazy eyes slowly opened in their direction, then grew wide when they finally registered their approach. The sound of panicked movements filled the air as they scrambled to stand in a line. "Do you have any questions about what you're to do?" Lady Zaradnik asked Kestrus. His mouth opened, then closed again. He still only had a vague idea of what she wanted, and even less of an idea why. Walking over to his hut, he retrieved the maps she had handed to him. "You asked if we were learned in writing yesterday," he said after returning. "Why?" "So you could record the results of the survey work," she replied. "As it is, you may use whatever means you are familiar with to note the plants, animals and other important features that you come across. You should be making special note of anything particularly rare or useful." Kestrus scratched his chin in thought. Was there a reason to be so thorough? What she asked for would take weeks. They still needed time to move in and build their homes as well. Winter was still months away, but this place was still cool, even in the summer. "Would it be enough to collect what grows in the area shown by each map?" he asked. "Of the plants, at least. We have no way to keep animals." "That will be fine," Lady Zaradnik replied. "Just be sure to remember what animals you do find when you deliver your report." Actually, the human lord turned to look in the direction of the hill, then back to him. "Rather than risk losing any information," she said, "Nonna will come and record their findings until your administrative aide arrives. I have much to go over with you before you start moving your people into the Vale." "Nonna?" "She is the senior administrative official of my domain. As Nonna and her subordinates will be coordinating with your people in the future, Now is as good a time as any to become familiar with one another. You should go ahead and get your people started. I will be waiting at your camp here." With that, she walked over to the fire and pulled out some sort of tome. The human lord appeared to pay them or their surroundings little mind as she flipped through its pages. Kestrus made his way down to the muddy shores of the floodplain, motioning for his hunters to follow. After looking out at the landscape of clumped marsh plants and waterlogged trees, he turned to address them. "So, are there any questions about what Lady Zaradnik has ordered us to do?" The hunters looked to one another, then Ezri spoke. "It's understandable enough," she said. "We are to identify the things in this place, and she wishes to record as much as possible for future reference." "I think she should have been talking to you instead of me." Kestrus eyed her tail, which was once again starting to swish about energetically. "Just listening to her makes me tired." "A task for hunters," she waved her hand lightly. "As chief, you have many other things to do, yes? Like placating this human lord. We were sent to explore this place anyways, and what she wants is one and the same. Just leave it to us." Her last statement was punctuated by the slap of her tail on the ground. Kestrus let out a sigh. It didn't take her very long at all to regain her excitement after angering the undead in the stronghold. At least she couldn't get herself into trouble out here. Probably. What was the human place like?" Yensius asked. "Did you see anything that might be dangerous?" "They live in caves dug into the hill," Kestrus said. "It's strange, I thought the travelers said that the humans lived in shelters that they built on the plains. There were many dozens of humans there, but I went straight to the dwelling of the human lord." "Then what was that like?" "It was." The hunters leaned forward as his voice trailed off. "It was what?" Eucharius prompted. Like a cave?" He held out his hands, trying to form what he described. There was a wooden part that extended out a little bit, so it looked a little bit larger than the other human dwellings. "You didn't see anything weird inside?" Ezri asked. "Weird? When the human lord came out with you, she smelled of blood." Kestrus never knew that bringing a skilled hunter could cause so many problems for him. There seemed to be no end to the troubles that she brought. "See, Chief," Yensius said fearfully, "you're not hiding anything from us, are you? The way you speak to this human lord has changed as well." "It smelled like blood," Kestrus said, "but we don't know what happened. Maybe they were preparing food or something." "Oh, don't forget to tell them about those flying cat beastmen too," Ezri's tail waved excitedly. "I've never seen such a large beastman before. It was twice as long as the chief. Its paws were 3 times the size of my head, the claws must have been like swords." Yensius cringed, holding her head in her hands. A terrified, keening sound issued from her throat. The other hunters started looking over their heads. "It didn't do anything." Kestrus tried to calm them down. "It just walked by with its livestock and flew over to the other side of the river. The humans didn't even pay any attention to it. Look, Lord Cocytus sent us here to find a place to live, so let's get started. There's supposed to be someone coming to record your findings, so make sure you cooperate. Let's not make a bad impression, all right?" Ezri's had already vanished into the reeds before he finished talking, and the others reluctantly went on their way. Kestrus was so tired, yet their work had barely begun. He shuffled back to the camp, where he found that a figure in black robes had joined Lady Zaradnik. "I thought I would introduce you to Nonna before she joined your surveyors," Lady Zaradnik said when he reached them. "Nonna is an attaché from the central administration, here to both assist with various tasks and learn about the different peoples of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. She is currently working as my head administrative official." "She?" Kestrus eyed the undead being as it was introduced. Why was it a she? There were many Nazaric old guardians around the Great Lake, but none were defined in such terms. There were none to be seen here, for that matter. In their place, even more powerful undead were employed. Was this land that much more dangerous than their old home? Everything here either did not make much sense or was outright worrisome. With the rich bounty of the land dangled before them, it felt like one of those old stories where a greedy child was enticed into a den of monsters. He dipped his head in greeting, and Nonna stared back at him silently in return. After a moment, the undead being went by him to head down to the floodplain. Lady Zaradnik cleared her throat. "She is not one for pleasantries," she told him, but she will become much warmer once you establish a working relationship. When your own village becomes large enough, you will have your own elder lich helping out there. For my village? That's right, she replied. Every administrative division in my territory will have at least one elder lich working in it. The harbor town will need more when it starts growing, but the villages usually only end up with one. Why would we need an elder lich to help us run things? He asked. I suppose we didn't actually see any at the Great Lake. How was your village organized? I believe you mentioned a chief, various heads and elders. Kestris had received much instruction in running a village, in accordance to his future role outside of the Great Lake, so he inwardly breathed a sigh of relief over the idea that they were now reviewing matters more familiar to him. After the war, he told her, Lord Cocytus gathered our people into a single village as an alliance of tribes. A unified council was created, with the chiefs of the old tribes, their heads and their elders. Lord Coctius oversaw proceedings sometimes, but daily matters were usually left for us to take care of. If there was anything important to discuss, we would let him know. That is roughly similar to the way humans do things, Lady Zaradnik said. So we can use the ways you are accustomed to as a starting point for how things are done here. In the future, each Lizardman village will be run by its own chief, and the entire tribe will be led by a council of your leaders. Each village, so you mean to have many Lizardmen come to live here? That would depend on several factors, she replied, but, provided that the fish farms are possible here, at least as many as necessary to meet the needs of the domain. There will be demand downriver as well, but I need to see the effects of these farms on the land before trying anything too ambitious. Why are you doing this? Because it is His Majesty's will, she said. As a member of the nobility, it is my duty to realize the will of the Sorcerer King. To follow the strong was the way of his people, but the human lord's tone towards this duty to Ainzul was not one of worship, nor was it grudging acceptance or the resignation of the weak. Her voice was tinged with something else, and Kestris wondered what it was. Is there a reason why you wish things done in this manner? He asked. You could rule us personally if you so chose. His initial fears were that she would come to rule them directly, driving the Lizardmen to serve in whatever purpose she had in mind for them. Many who witnessed the brutal outcome of their duel feared that they had fallen out of favor and would be handed to a tyrant, one whom Lord Cocytus claimed would instill fear into them again. Well, she was still frightening enough as it was. Because that is the way of things, her lips turned up slightly. All peoples have members of their own that lead them. Lizardmen have Lizardman lords, do they not? In the past, the Lizardman tribes were led by the strongest amongst them. Only one or two chieftains might be what one might consider a Lizardman lord, though Shazhiryu Shasha, who appears to have the same mysterious power as you, currently heads to council. It is no great mystery, she said. Not anymore, at least. You seem to have trained enough under Lord Cocytus for him to recognize your quality. Have you heard him refer to classes and levels? These words I have heard before, he replied. There is much confusion about them, however. Many feel that the old way of looking at things makes more sense. That is perfectly understandable, Lady Zaradnik nodded. Until one comes to their own realization of this aspect of our world, it is difficult to grasp, let alone work with. I am still developing my own understanding, but I am confident that I know enough that it can be used to our advantage. The Baroness reached down to arrange a dozen large branches over the campfire. The flames rose, and Kestris grew more alert as warmth seeped into him. The lords that you see amongst many races are actually a type of class, Lady Zaradnik said, dusting off her hands. Though different races have various qualities unique to them, all lords appear to manifest abilities useful in leading their people. I still find it strange to refer to myself as such, but, as a frontier noble, I am probably recognized as a human lord by demi-humans who have lords of their own. You seem to have come to this understanding as well, comparing my abilities to those of this Shazhiryu Shasha. Kestris nodded slowly. It made a sort of sense, and having her use similar abilities on him might be seen as proof of her claim. I understand your words, he said. But our chiefs earn their positions through ceremonial contests of strength and proof of their value as leaders. I may be chief for now, but should someone stronger come along, should the strongest not lead? It may be presumptuous of me, Lady Zaradnik replied, but I believe that leaders should be groomed from a young age. Humans have many vocations, classes, if you will, and those who become the most proficient at their work are the ones that have done so from a young age and pursued it without diverting from their course. An excellent smith is not also an excellent tailor, farmer and miner, they are just a smith. People who divide their efforts between disparate paths are never as proficient as those who focus on one. To this end, my subjects are respected for the fruits of their labor, the expertise and products only they can deliver. So it is the same with any class. I do not make judgments solely based on how strong or weak someone is. Those who are strong, those with high levels, are so because they must be. A smith must be high level because they are needed to craft the best equipment possible. An enchanter must be high level in order to ensure that this excellent equipment is imbued with the best magics possible. A warrior must be high level because, without their strength, all else can be stolen away. With the support of the people that they defend, they will be equipped with the best items possible so they may perform their duties to the highest standard. It is difficult to discern who can excel, but we must support all so we can have the strongest society as a whole. This is a bit of wisdom from my own faith, something proven time and again. With the knowledge provided by the Sorceress Kingdom, as well as the resources allocated to the study of this wisdom, the truth only becomes more clear. Your own faith? Kestrus frowned. You do not worship Ainzulgaun? Come to think of it, he saw no statues or monuments to Ainzulgaun in this place, only the flags of the Sorceress Kingdom waving here and there. I do not, Lady Zaradnik said. My gods are the 6 great gods of humanity, who came to live amongst us over 6 centuries ago. It is their wisdom that I refer to, and their tenets that have guided my house. But Ainzulgaun is the supreme god of death. The human lord stilled and stared at him for a long while. Kestrus knew little of human expressions, but he had the distinct feeling that he said something he shouldn't have. Then what of our offerings to him? He pushed their conversation along. Our tributes? Religious offerings aside, she replied, we generally do not deliver tributes here, we pay taxes. Taxes? Simply put, this territory is my title, granted to me by the Sorceress Kingdom to manage. My vassals take up contracts of tenancy, and a share of the land's production is paid to them for their skills and labor. The remainder goes towards the maintenance, security and development of the domain. This was certainly not something that was done at the Great Lake. Even now, they relied on the generosity of Ainzulgaun to provide for their needs as they awaited their fish farms to become fully operational. The description of taxes was an unfamiliar thing. In the past, the lizardmen took care of their own families, foraging or hunting for what they needed. No one demanded that a portion be given up simply for using the land, not the chiefs, nor Lord Cocytus. How are we to survive these taxes? He asked. We barely had enough to live before. That is one purpose of this survey being conducted, she answered. Taxes only come with production, so you will not be paying them until we've established what is necessary for a single village to survive, and how much land each one is capable of managing. At the bare minimum, every village will not be lacking for basic needs, so you need not worry about that. Do you see any problems with this? If her words were spoken truly, Kestrus thought it was far better than their initial expectations. Spectacularly so. Over time, there would be more lizardmen living here than at the Great Lake. He felt a thrill of anticipation at the prospect, and his tail started waving over the gravel. If it is possible, he said, I would like to see my people prosper here. Good, Lady Zaradnik's teeth gleamed at him. Then, while your rangers perform their survey work, I will begin your instruction in the ways of lordship. It will be a long process, but you will learn how to read and write, how your tribe will integrate with the rest of my domain, and become familiar with the laws, institutions and customs of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Kestra's tail went limp again.